All right, so today we're diving into Husserl, specifically his ideas on transcendental intersubjectivity. We're using Dan Zahavi's book on Husserl. For those who maybe haven't encountered his work before,
All right.
who was he? And what was he trying to do with this whole idea of transcendental intersubjectivity?
Well, Husserl was a German philosopher who lived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And he's considered the founder of a philosophical movement called phenomenology.
Phenomenology.
And I think it's helpful to understand a little bit about phenomenology to grasp what he's getting at with intersubjectivity.
Okay, so what is phenomenology then?
In a nutshell, phenomenology is the study of conscious experience.
Okay.
It's all about trying to understand the structures of experience, how our minds make sense of the world.
Interesting.
So instead of asking, what is the world really like?
Right.
Phenomenologists ask, how do we experience the world?
I see. So it's more about the subjective experience of reality rather than trying to define some objective truth.
Precisely.
Okay, so how does this connect to intersubjectivity?
Well, one of Husserl's key insights was that our experience of the world is always already intersubjective.
Intersubjective.
Meaning that it's shaped by the existence of other people.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where this is going, but can you unpack that a little bit more?
Sure. So for Husserl, our very understanding of ourselves as subjects is dependent on our recognition of other subjects.
Yeah.
In other words, we can't really understand who we are without recognizing that there are other people out there.
Right.
Who also have their own experiences and perspectives.
Yeah, it's like that saying, no man is an island. Okay, so solipsism, the idea that maybe we're all just, brains in vats and nothing outside of our own minds exists.
Right.
That's not really compatible with Husserl's view.
Well, Husserl actually starts with the problem of solipsism.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of his jumping off point.
So how does he move beyond solipsism then?
Through this idea of intersubjectivity, he argues that our experience of the world is always already structured by the possibility of other perspectives.
Okay, hold on.
Okay.
I need to wrap my head around this.
Okay.
So let's say I'm looking at a tree.
Okay.
Am I saying that the tree only exists because other people can also see it?
It's more like the very possibility of another person seeing that tree from a different angle.
Right.
Is built into your own experience of the tree.
Okay, so it's not just about what I see.
Right.
It's about the potential for a shared experience.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Even if you're the only one actually looking at the tree at that moment.
Yeah.
The idea that someone else could come along and see it too is part of what makes it real for you.
Okay, so it's like there's this kind of implicit understanding that my experience is not the only possible experience.
Precisely.
And that's what makes it real in a sense.
Yes. And Husserl argues that this is true not just for individual objects like trees,
Right.
but for the world as a whole.
So our entire experience of reality is shaped by this understanding that there are other minds out there experiencing the world alongside us.
And he even says, the world is experienced as our common world.
Our common world.
There belongs to its own sense as objective world, the categorical form once for all, truly existing not only for me, but for everyone.
Wow. Okay. So it's not just that we happen to share the same world.
Right.
It's that the world is fundamentally intersubjective.
Yes. The very idea of an objective world requires the existence of other experiencing subjects.
Okay. That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. So we're not just, passive observers of reality. We're actually co-creating it through our interactions with each other.
That's a great way to put it.
But hold on a second.
Yeah.
If reality is so intertwined with other minds, how do we know we're not all just living in a shared hallucination?
That's a great question, and one that Husserl addresses with the concept of normality.
Normality.
Yeah. So for Husserl,
Okay.
shared understanding is grounded in a web of norms.
Norms. Okay.
Ways of perceiving and interacting with the world that we develop together.
So like social norms and cultural norms.
Norms that help us navigate the social world.
And these norms, are they like fixed and unchanging, or?
No, they're constantly evolving.
Okay.
As we interact with each other and encounter new situations.
So it's like a constant process of negotiation and renegotiation.
Exactly. And disagreement and conflict are actually crucial to this process.
So arguing can actually be a good thing.
For Husserl, yes.
Wow.
Because it forces us to examine our assumptions.
Okay.
And to try to understand the other person's perspective.
So it's like a way of testing and refining our understanding of the world.
And through this process of dialogue and debate, we move towards a higher level of objectivity.
Now that's an interesting thought, that arguing actually brings us closer to objectivity.
It is, isn't it?
So you're saying that, instead of just retreating into our own little bubbles
Mm-hmm.
and only talking to people who agree with us, we should actually be seeking out different perspectives and engaging in healthy debate.
Because that's how we challenge our own assumptions and expand our understanding of the world.
I like that idea.
And Husserl uses this really fascinating thought experiment to illustrate this point.
Okay, what is it?
It's the bookcase example.
The bookcase example.
Yeah.
Remind me.
So imagine you're looking at a bookcase.
Okay, I'm picturing a bookcase.
You see it from your particular perspective,
Right.
but you also understand that someone else could come along and see it from a different angle.
Hmm?
Maybe they're standing on the other side of the room, or they're taller or shorter than you.
Right.
And so they would have a slightly different view of the bookcase.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
But it's not just about you and one other person.
Okay.
Husserl says it's about an infinite network of potential perspective.
An infinite network of perspectives.
Every possible vantage point, every way that bookcase could be seen by any possible observer.
So every possible angle,
Yeah.
every possible lighting condition, even like the bookcase at different points in time as it ages and changes.
Yes, all of those potential perspectives contribute to the reality of the bookcase.
So it's not just a static object, it's like this constantly evolving entity.
And this gets to the heart of Husserl's view of the world as a historical product.
Okay.
It's constantly being shaped and reshaped through our interactions and the knowledge that's passed down through generations.
So the world isn't this fixed, unchanging thing.
Right.
It's more like a story that we're all writing together.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
What I'm really curious about is, for someone who's already deep into phenomenology, what really stands out about Zahavi's take on this?
Well, I think what's really fascinating about Zahavi's approach is how he really emphasizes that for Husserl, intersubjectivity isn't just sort of an add-on,
Right.
to transcendental phenomenology. Like, oh, after we've done all the work on the solitary, subject and consciousness, then we kind of like tack on other people.
Right.
He really makes a strong argument that it's really foundational.
Yeah, that's interesting because I do tend to think of, like, Husserl's method, the epiche and the reduction, as very much kind of this inward-focused process. It's like bracketing the world to examine the structures of consciousness. And that almost, it feels like shutting out other people to do that.
Right.
So how do we get from there to this idea that other people are fundamental?
Yeah, and that's, I think, where Zahavi makes such a crucial point is that the epiche, it's not eliminating the world or other people. It's really about suspending our naive assumptions about them.
Right.
So we can actually kind of examine, well, how are those experiences constituted in the first place?
Okay.
And Husserl's real point is that we don't even get to a concept of self without the other already being in play.
So it's not like I achieve self-awareness in isolation.
Yeah.
And then, now I guess I had to deal with the fact that there are other minds out there. It's like, it's a package deal from the beginning.
Yeah, it's very much a package deal. And Zahavi, he really drives home this idea that for Husserl, the experience of the world, the self, and others, they're all intertwined right from the start. They're co-constituted. And he even points to, these ideas of primordial and intersubjective transcendence to illustrate this.
Yeah, now that's a concept I always struggle with a little bit.
Okay. Sure. So primordial transcendence is really just this very basic idea that the object exists beyond my individual active perception. So like whether or not I'm looking at that chair, it still exists, right?
Right.
But intersubjective transcendence kind of takes it a step further and suggests that the world's reality is actually confirmed precisely because it can be experienced by multiple subjects.
Oh, okay.
You see.
So it's not just that, like, the chair exists when I turn my back to it, but that it exists in a shared space that other people can also experience.
And this is key because for Husserl, the experience of other subjects isn't just there to kind of like confirm, okay, the world is really out there. It's objective.
Right.
It's also really essential for us to understand our own selves.
Right. It's through interaction with other minds that we really kind of develop a full sense of who we are.
Okay, that makes me think of Husserl's concept of horizon intentionality, which I find so fascinating.
Yeah.
How does Zahavi connect that to this idea of intersubjectivity?
Well, he does it beautifully. Horizon intentionality means that whenever we perceive something, we're also kind of co-intending, a whole horizon of potentialities and absent features,
Yeah.
And Zahavi argues that this includes the potential for other minds to experience the same object,
Mm.
and even, to have their own thoughts and reactions to it.
So it's not just that I see a tree and I can imagine, oh, there are roots underneath that I can't see.
Right,
But
exactly.
that my experience of the tree also includes this possibility that someone else is looking at it too and maybe thinking, oh, that'd be fun to climb or whatever. And that shared horizon of potential experiences is really, I think, crucial for us to, grounding our understanding of the world
Right.
and ourselves as
Right.
part of, this community of experiencers.
Okay, but what happens when those experiences clash?
Right.
Because not everyone perceives things the same way. And Husserl does talk about the possibility of dissent,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to hear how Zahavi addresses that.
Yeah, he brings up how this concept of normality really plays a role in kind of establishing what we consider to be objective.
Right.
So if I see a bluebird and everyone around me agrees it's blue, that's kind of reinforcing my belief in that experience.
Right.
But what if someone says, well, no, I think it's green?
Yeah, that'll throw a wrench in things.
Right.
So does Zahavi suggest we just, dismiss dissenting voices?
No, not at all. In fact, he highlights how dissent, while it can be challenging, can actually be really crucial for refining our understanding. Right. It forces us to kind of re-examine our assumptions about, well, what constitutes objectivity in the first place?
Yeah.
Maybe the person sees a different shade of blue because of the lighting. Or maybe their whole, understanding of blue is slightly different.
Right, right.
So instead of shutting down disagreement, we should see it as this opportunity to refine our shared understanding of the world.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it can be a way to arrive at a more nuanced, maybe even a more accurate picture of reality rather than just kind of relying on what's considered normal.
That's really interesting. Makes me wonder how Husserl saw this process of shared understanding kind of evolving over time.
Yeah, well, Zahavi brings up how, for Husserl, the world is really this historical product.
Okay.
It's constantly being shaped and reshaped by the intersubjective experiences of generations.
Right.
So we kind of inherit a world that's already infused with meaning from those who came before us. And through our interactions, we kind of contribute to this ongoing development of the world. So it's not just about me and you agreeing on the color of a bluebird today.
Right.
It's about, how our understanding of bluebird has evolved over centuries of shared observation and...
And Zahavi connects this to this really interesting concept of self-monetization, this idea that our understanding of ourselves is really intertwined with this historical, intersubjective world. We're
Yeah.
not just these isolated minds.
Right.
Our very sense of self kind of arises through, our interaction with this shared world and the perspectives of others.
Now, that brings up something I've always wondered about with Husserl.
Okay.
If our sense of self is so intertwined with this shared world, doesn't that kind of undermine the idea of individual perspective?
Yeah.
Do we risk losing the unique I in all this talk of intersubjectivity?
That's a really astute observation, and in fact, that's a critique that has been leveled against Husserl, even by those who were deeply influenced by him.
Oh, interesting. So even within kind of the Husserlian camp, there were those who felt like he went a little too far in emphasizing the collective. I'm really curious to hear more about that. So who are some of these critics and what were their main concerns?
Well, one of the most prominent critiques comes from Eugen Fink, who was actually a very close collaborator with Husserl.
Okay.
And Fink argued that Husserl's later work actually hinted at this idea of a primal life,
Okay.
sort of a pre-ecological state that precedes the distinction between self and other.
So like a primordial soup of consciousness where there's no I versus you yet.
Right, exactly.
Okay. But wouldn't that kind of contradict, Husserl's whole framework of individual subjects as the basis for intersubjectivity?
That's exactly Fink's point.
Okay.
He believed that this primal life concept really kind of undermined the very distinction between subjects that Husserl was building upon. It's as if Husserl was suggesting this kind of underlying unity that precedes individual differentiation.
Yeah.
Which seems to contradict, his focus on the individual ego.
Okay, so we've got Fink, kind of calling out Husserl for a potential inconsistency here.
Uh-huh.
I imagine there were counter arguments to this.
Absolutely. And one of the strongest counter arguments comes from Zahavi himself.
Okay.
He argues that Fink's interpretation actually misses the mark.
Okay.
For Zahavi, Husserl never abandoned that fundamental distinction between subjects.
So it's like a real philosophical showdown. Fink's saying there's this primal oneness,
Right.
and Zahavi's countering that. No, Husserl never wavered on the importance of distinct individuals.
Exactly.
Well,
And I think this debate really highlights a core tension, I think, in Husserl's work.
yeah.
Even if we accept Zahavi's defense, it still raises questions about how Husserl ultimately reconciles, the uniqueness of individual experience with this seemingly shared reality that we all inhabit. If each subject is the starting point for their experience, how do we avoid falling into, like, radical subjectivism?
Right.
Is there really a shared world out there, or are we all just trapped in our own little bubbles?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it leads us to another major criticism of Husserl, the idea that he ultimately privileges the individual ego,
Right.
and that this might actually undermine the very intersubjectivity that he's trying to establish.
Hold on. So now he's being accused of both being too focused on, like, the unity A and D, too individualistic.
Right, exactly. Right?
That's a hard balance to strike.
It is. It is. And this critique really points to, the difficulty of reconciling that uniqueness of the I with, the shared world of the we.
All right. This is where I'm starting to feel my brain needing a break.
Yeah, me too.
So, before the break, we were kind of wrestling with this idea that Husserl might be privileging the individual ego, even while, advocating for this idea of intersubjectivity. And I think this is where Zahavi's analysis becomes, really illuminating.
Yeah, you're right, because it is a valid concern, right?
Yeah.
If I'm ultimately the one constructing the world, even the experience of others,
Yeah.
Doesn't that undermine the whole idea of a shared reality?
Yeah, and Zahavi tackles this head on. He does it by distinguishing between, what he calls the empirical ego and the transcendental ego. So remember, the empirical ego is the me with my, specific experiences and memories and preferences, kind of that everyday self that we typically identify with.
Right, like the me that's having this conversation right now. But the transcendental ego is this sort of deeper, more fundamental level of consciousness that makes all of those experiences possible. It's the structure that allows for intentionality, for consciousness to be directed at things.
Okay, so it's like the operating system kind of running underneath the surface of my everyday awareness.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, but how does that help us with this issue of intersubjectivity?
Right, because Husserl's point is that this transcendental ego isn't isolated. It's
Yeah.
inherently connected to other transcendental egos, forming this network of intersubjectivity.
Yeah.
So it's not that, my ego kind of creates the world and then imposes it on others.
Right. It's more like we're all, participating in this collaborative project of world making. Each ego kind of contributing its unique perspective.
I see. So it's not about like my ego versus your ego. It's about this deeper level of interconnectedness that allows us to co-constitute this shared reality.
Exactly.
Okay, but then doesn't that still leave us with the problem of, like, how we actually grasp the other's unique perspective?
Right.
If we're all starting from our own transcendental egos, how do we avoid simply projecting ourselves onto others?
Yeah, and that's where empathy comes in.
Okay.
Zahavi emphasizes that for Husserl, empathy isn't just, about kind of mirroring someone's emotions.
Right.
It's a much deeper cognitive capacity. It allows us to understand the other person as a subject with their own experiences and their own perspective on the world.
So it's not just feeling with someone.
Right.
It's grasping their distinct way of being in the world.
Precisely. And this is where things get really interesting, because Husserl actually suggests that this empathic understanding, it actually transforms our own experience. It's not just about, like, adding their perspective to mine. It's about fundamentally altering my own understanding of the world.
Okay, now that's what I was looking for, the aha
Right.
moment.
Right.
So through empathy, I'm not just acknowledging the other, I'm actively, changing my own way of being in the world.
Yeah.
That seems crucial for, avoiding the trap of solipsism.
Exactly. Yeah. And this process is ongoing, right? We're constantly encountering, new perspectives, new ways of understanding.
Right.
And that forces us to kind of revise and refine our own, understanding.
Yeah. So intersubjectivity is this dynamic kind of interplay of perspectives. But if we're constantly revising, doesn't that make reality seem kind of unstable? Like, how do we ground any sense of like shared meaning or truth in a world where everyone's perspective is constantly shifting?
Right. That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of, some of the challenges that Husserl's theory faces. One way he addresses this is through this concept of what he calls a community of reason.
Okay.
So, a group of people who are committed to open and honest dialogue and to challenging their own biases.
So it's not just about any random group of people. It's about, like, specifically those who are engaged in this pursuit of
Mhm.
truth and understanding.
Exactly. And Zahavi highlights how this requires, intellectual humility.
Right.
This willingness to acknowledge that, we might be wrong, that our perspective is limited. It's through that kind of, rigorous good faith dialogue that, a more stable shared understanding can emerge.
I see. So it's not about erasing individual perspectives. It's about, like, bringing them into conversation in a way that allows for, genuine understanding and the possibility of consensus.
Precisely. But of course, that raises the question of, how does Husserl account for those who refuse to engage in that kind of good faith dialogue?
Right.
Those
Right.
who cling to their own perspective even when presented with, evidence to the contrary.
You're right. We've talked about how, like, dissent can be productive, but what about those who are, like, willfully ignorant, or those who just, prioritize their own perspective above all else?
Yeah.
Does Husserl even address that at all?
That's a tough question. And it's one that, exposes some potential limitations, I think, in Husserl's framework. He was writing in a very different historical context. And the concept of, bad faith actors, of those who are actively trying to kind of undermine shared reality, it might not have been as prevalent, I think, as it is today.
That's true. But I wonder if we can still find any clues, in his work that might help us address this challenge.
Yeah.
Even if he didn't explicitly address this problem of, like, bad faith actors, his insights into intersubjectivity might still, offer valuable tools for thinking about how to bridge divides and build understanding in a world where, those divides seem to be growing wider and wider.
I think that's a really important point, and it's one that Zahavi touches on when he discusses Husserl's later work on what he calls the lived body.
So,
Remember we talked about how Husserl began to really emphasize, the role of embodiment in shaping our understanding of the world and ourselves.
right, this idea that we're not just disembodied minds.
Right.
We're beings who experience the world through our senses, through our movements, through our interactions with the physical environment.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm curious to see how that connects to these challenges of intersubjectivity.
Yeah, so Zahavi points out that for Husserl, the lived body really becomes the site where consciousness and world intersect. It's not just a physical object, it's the very medium of our experience. The way in which we kind of encounter and engage with the world around us.
So it's like the bridge between, like, our inner world of thoughts and feelings and this external world of objects and other people.
And this has really profound implications for intersubjectivity, because it means that, our connection with others isn't just a matter of shared ideas or perspectives.
Right.
It's also a matter of shared embodiment.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So it's not just about me, like, understanding your thoughts. It's about recognizing that we both experience the world through our bodies.
Right.
Like that we share this fundamental, embodied existence.
Precisely. And that shared embodiment, according to Husserl, can be a really powerful source of empathy and understanding.
Yeah.
Think about, how we instinctively respond to, someone's facial expressions or their posture, their tone of voice.
Right.
We're constantly reading each other's bodies, even when we're not aware of it.
Right. It's like our bodies are speaking a language, that goes beyond words. Language that's communicating emotions, intentions, even shared vulnerabilities.
And this embodied level of communication, can be incredibly powerful. It can help us to connect with others on this much deeper level, even when, we disagree on intellectual or ideological grounds.
So even if I don't agree with your ideas, I can still recognize your humanity,
Right.
your shared experience of being in the world, through your body language, your expressions, your way of moving through space. It's like this deeper level of connection that kind of bypasses the intellectual arguments.
And this, I think, is one of the most hopeful aspects of Husserl's later work on intersubjectivity. It suggests that even in a world where communication so often breaks down, where we seem to be kind of retreating into our own echo chambers, there's still a possibility for connection and understanding at this deeper, embodied level.
That's a really powerful thought.
Yeah.
It gives me hope that even in our increasingly polarized world, we can still find ways to bridge the divides and build genuine connections with each other. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Husserl's Transcendental Intersubjectivity, and we've covered a lot of ground. From the idea of co-constitution to the role of empathy, and the challenges of dissent. Now, I'm kind of curious to explore how these ideas have kind of resonated beyond Husserl himself.
Well, you're in for a treat because Husserl's work, especially on intersubjectivity and the lived body, really had a profound influence, I think, on a whole generation of philosophers. Thinkers like Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty.
Right.
They all kind of grappled with his ideas, developing them, sometimes diverging in really fascinating ways.
Okay, that's exciting. So let's start with Heidegger. I'll admit I've always found him a bit intimidating.
Oh yeah.
But I'm ready to try and wrap my head around his take on intersubjectivity.
Yeah, it's true. Heidegger can be a real challenge, but his insights are worth the effort. So he kind of took Husserl's concept of being in the world, and really kind of deepened it, arguing that this being is always inherently being with others. He called this fundamental way of being dissent, and for him it's not something we choose. It's the very structure of human existence.
So for Heidegger, even more so than for Husserl, we're not just capable of connecting with others. We're already always connected in some way.
Exactly. Yeah. And this connectedness really shapes our understanding of the world, our values, even our sense of self. Heidegger argued that we're constantly influenced by what he called the they, this kind of anonymous collective force that shapes our norms and expectations.
That sounds a bit ominous, like we're all just conforming to social pressure without even realizing it.
Yeah.
Was Heidegger that pessimistic about our ability to kind of break free from this they self?
Well, he was certainly critical of, how easily we can kind of get swept up in the they and lose sight of our individuality, our authenticity. But he also believed that through a process of self-awareness, a willingness to kind of confront our own mortality and choose our own path, that we can achieve a more authentic way of being with others.
So it's not about rejecting the they altogether. It's about becoming aware of its influence.
Right. Authenticity for Heidegger doesn't mean, isolating ourselves. It means, engaging with others from a place of self-awareness and genuine care. It's about recognizing, I think, our shared existence and choosing to build relationships based on understanding rather than just conformity.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. Makes me think about how we navigate those, social pressures in our own lives.
Yeah.
Where do we conform? Where do we rebel? And how do those choices shape our relationships with others?
Excellent questions. And now, if we shift gears to Sartre, we find a very different but equally compelling, I think, take on intersubjectivity. He's famous for that line, "Hell is other people," which really captures his view that the other can be a source of, conflict and anxiety.
Oh yes, Sartre, the champion of radical freedom.
Yeah.
I can see how he might have some issues with Husserl's idea of a shared reality.
Yeah.
Did he think we're all just doomed to clash with each other?
Well, Sartre was certainly wary of any attempt to kind of smooth over the radical difference between the self and the other. He argued that the other's gaze, their judgment, it can feel like a threat to our freedom. But that doesn't mean that he saw all relationships as doomed. In fact, he wrote extensively about the possibility of authentic love and communication.
So even though the other can be, a source of conflict, there's still a way to connect with them authentically.
For Sartre, yeah, it all kind of comes down to recognizing the other's freedom. It's about acknowledging their right to choose their own path, even if it differs from our own. And that requires, I think, a willingness to let go of control, to embrace, the uncertainty and vulnerability that are kind of inherent in human relationships.
Okay, I'm seeing a theme here. it seems like all these thinkers, despite their differences, they recognize this fundamental tension between our desire for connection and our need for freedom.
Yeah.
Like, how do we balance these two, seemingly opposing forces?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think it's one that, we continue to grapple with today. But one more thinker I want to kind of bring into the conversation here is Merleau-Ponty, who brought a really crucial emphasis back to the body's role in intersubjectivity.
Yeah, Merleau-Ponty. I've always been drawn to his focus on embodied experience.
Yeah.
So how did he kind of build on Husserl's work?
Well, Merleau-Ponty, he argued that our bodies are not just, objects in the world. They're the very medium of our experience.
Yeah.
We perceive the world through our bodies. We move through the world with our bodies, and we connect with others through our bodies. He called this intercorporeity, this kind of shared space of embodied experience.
So it's not just, our minds kind of meet and mingle. It's our bodies as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Think about, how much we communicate through nonverbal cues, through facial expressions, gestures, tone of voice. We're constantly reading each other's bodies, and that reading is crucial for understanding and empathy.
Right. It's like we're speaking a silent language with our bodies.
Yes.
Conveying, emotions, intentions, things that go beyond words.
Exactly.
And that language, I imagine, can be, particularly powerful in bridging divides and building connections.
Yeah, absolutely. Merleau-Ponty also emphasized how our sense of self is rooted in our bodily experience. We don't just think about ourselves. We feel ourselves as embodied beings, situated in the world and in relation to others. And this really challenges the idea that the mind is somehow, separate from the body, and it really reinforces this interconnectedness that's at the heart of intersubjectivity.
Okay, so we've kind of come full circle back to Husserl's concept of the lived body.
Yeah.
It's not just a shell for the mind. It's the very ground of our being in the world and our connection with others.
And this embodied understanding of intersubjectivity, I think, has really profound implications for how we kind of navigate the complexities of our increasingly interconnected world.
Yeah. This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking. It's given me a lot to think about.
I hope it sparked a similar sense of curiosity and wonder in our listeners.
I think it has.
After all, the exploration of intersubjectivity is an ongoing journey.
Yeah.
A never-ending quest to understand the profound mystery of our shared existence.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Husserl and Transcendental Intersubjectivity. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.